So, I last was discussing the British Mandate period and the fact that you had Jewish communities and Arab communities um, raising up the level of identity politics and nationalist aspirations. To clarify some things, um, you did have some, like I've always told you, I mentioned that there was always been small pockets of religious Jews in Palestine, but they were a minority and they weren't a part of the Zionist movement. Maybe there was an individual here or there, and some of them actually opposed the Zionist movement. Remember, for many religious Jews, Jews were in exile because they disobeyed God, and they said that galut, or exile, was something that they had to just deal with, that God set it up that way. And Zionism was seen as kind of usurping God's plan. And so for the Zionists, they thought, oh, this is ghetto thinking. For religious Jews to have this fatalistic idea that we just got to suffer because God wanted us to, and to do it this way. It's ridiculous. Although later, especially with the success that the Zionists would start to have, many religious Jews and rabbis started changing their tune and becoming actually Zionists themselves. But like I said, initially there was a strong resistance. To this day in Israel, there's actually rabid anti-Zionist religious Jews who call for the end of the Israeli state and even side with the Palestinians. Anyhow, so just giving you an idea. But the majority now of religious Jews in Israel are Zionists, just to let you know. Okay. For the Arabs, by the way, so I want to also clarify what a lot of there were several ways that Jews were attaining land. They had what's called the Jewish National Fund. They would pool money together, and they would buy land, often off absentee Arab landowners, or Turkish landowners, and sometimes off to local Arabs. And they would take property and then make what's called kibbutzim, the kind of community, like communal Jewish areas, and they had everything set up basically for only Jews: labor, work, self-contained Jewish communities. Resentment started happening for a lot of local Arabs is that land was taken that they thought would be theirs, and then often Arabs were evicted, lived on the land at the expense of Jewish community being brought in. A lot of this was legal, and there was one Zionist, I think his name was Yitzhak Epstein, that basically said we need to consider, we Zionists, that we're not breaking any legal laws, but we're definitely being antagonistic, and the anger of the Arabs is escalating. We should keep that in mind. Others thought that was ridiculous to take in consideration. And then you actually had Jewish terrorist groups that wanted to terrorize Arabs off the land. We're going to talk more about those later. They might have been a minority, but of course they were a part of that. And then you had other Zionists that wanted to integrate the Arabs into Jewish immigration. One was Achad Hayam, or Asher Ginsburg is his original name. Achad Hayam means one of the people. That was his pen name. And he had believed in cultural Zionism, this idea of just Jewish life within Palestine integrated with the Arabs. So again, there was different types of visions that Zionists had. So now we're going into the more popular and successful branches of Zionism. There were many groups. David Ben-Gurion, next to Herzl, is one of the more important ones to know. He was one of the left-wing Zionists, and he led many Zionist groups. He was a socialist from his youth. He traveled from Poland to Russia to the Ottoman Palestine in 1906. He settled in New York for a while in 1915. Remember I told you he wrote that book while he was living there. He returned with his family to Palestine after World War I, and he became a leader of the labor Zionist movement and a de facto leader basically of a good portion of the Jews in Palestine. He was actually even, you could say, a communist at one point. But the thing is about him is that he was more of a Jewish nationalist than he was a socialist. And there's actually an Israeli historian that kind of talks about that aspect, that there was a kind of nationalist socialism that he participated in, and the nationalism trumped the socialism. In fact, so keeping in mind that the founders of Israeli society, from Herzl to Ben-Gurion, are not religious, they're secular, they're even borderline communist, some of them, definitely like socialist. Okay, not what you think about. This is not a religious state per se, okay, in a way that maybe some of you might be thinking that Israel was started, okay? So he was one. Another significant, less popular, but important character to mention is ZE'EV VLADIMIR JABOTINSKY. He's the founder of right-wing Zionism, and I would say ultra-nationalist to just, well, I'll give you some quotes of his and then you can see what I'm saying. Well, actually, let's go over his biography here. He was born in Odessa, fought for the British against the Turks. He led Jewish self-defense groups. He was anti-socialist. I put fascist like question mark. You could really say he was a fascist. Now, fascist more like in the Italian influence. All of his ideas were very close to like what you would see with Mussolini. You could say he was like Hitler, but that's misleading in the sense that obviously he was pro-Jewish, but this idea of being super race-based, about the collective as opposed to class war, I would say he's a fascist, and I believe that he even gave some lip service to some of those ideas. He was very active in Palestine by the 1920s. Again, he's inspiration of extreme Israeli nationalists. As a matter of fact, the Likud party that Netanyahu of Israel currently is a part of, their founding, their inspiration comes from Jabotinsky. So the current Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu loves Jabotinsky, and I believe he quoted from him. I saw him in a speech once. So what were some of the things that Jabotinsky would say? Not only are the Turks no cousin of ours, even with the real Ishmael, we have nothing in common. Talking about the Arabs, right? We belong to Europe, thank God. For 2,000 years, we helped to build European civilization. So it goes back to what I was telling you about the Europe versus the Middle East, and that the Zionists saw themselves as Europeans coming into the Middle East. Then he says, over here, deriving from the Jewish colonization, there is no question of ousting the Arabs. On the contrary, the idea is that Palestine on both sides of the Jordan should hold the Arabs, their progeny, and many millions of Jews. What I do not deny is that process, the Arabs of Palestine will necessarily become a minority in the country of Palestine. What I do deny is that is a hardship. It is not a hardship on any race, any nation possessing so many national states. One fraction, one branch of that race, and not a big one, will have to live in someone else's state. So he's basically arguing that the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, of Arabs for the sake of the Jews, that the Arabs living there have a want and the Jews have a need. Do you buy into that argument? It's one he made, and those who still are influenced by him tend to have that political vision about the Arabs living in Palestine now. I'll end that lecture here.